Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the substitute. It suffers from the same fatal flaws that the underlying bill does. On the appeal issue, for example, it adds another reason for delay and reconsideration that will slow down the election process that frankly has worked and I think is improved by the National Labor Relations Board's rule. But my objection really goes to a deeper point than that. What we're doing today reminds me of a fire company will be called to the site of a burning building. And there's people trapped top of the burning building, desperate trouble. There's a propane tank in the parking lot's about to blow if you don't control the fire. And there's a lady in the parking lot who sprained her ankle. So the fire and rescue squad rushes to the scene, ignores the people trapped at the top of the burning building, doesn't shut the fire down before it gets the propane tank, but immediately gets to work on the lady with the sprained ankle. There may or may not be changes in labor law the committee ought to be considering. But there is a crisis in this country in unemployment and a stagnant economy, and the committee continues to ignore that crisis. Half the people surveyed in a recent survey said that they believe that the American dream is either dead or on life support from their perspective. Small wonder they believe this. People fortunate enough to have a job are working longer hours and seeing their incomes shrink as they do. People who bought a home a few years ago and made their payments faithfully find out their home is worth far less than it was the day that they bought it. People who sacrificed and saved and borrowed to get an education now find that after they've achieved that education, they can't get their first job out of school. A survey yesterday said that 9% of the American people have a positive opinion of the Congress. I've not yet met anyone in that 9%, by the way, and I'm not in that 9% myself. 91% of the American people believe we are not addressing the country's problems. This markup this morning is Exhibit A as to why they're upset about that. This committee could be working on proposals that would help increase demand for small businesses for their services so they could add more people, but we are not. We could be working on the problems of people that used to work in oil refineries or manufacturing plants who could be retrained to get jobs in the sectors of the economy that are growing, but we are not. The committee this morning could be focusing on promising areas of research and development that could grow and have American companies and businesses export their products to the rest of the world, but we are not. We are engaged in what is almost a metaphysical dispute about regulations that the National Labor Relations Board is using, or putting into place, I should say. So I not only think that this amendment is the wrong policy, it's the wrong bill, it's the wrong issue on the committee's agenda. The real job creators in this country are small employers with 50 or fewer employees. They create 2/3 of the jobs in this country. Members of our caucus have spent the last 30 days listening and meeting with about 2,000 of those job generators. Here is what they have told us. We need more customers in our stores and businesses. We're having a hard time borrowing money if we believe we have the chance to expand. We're having a hard time finding skilled workers to fill the jobs we can create. And yes, some of them are raising regulatory issues that we should be addressing and fixing. But to spend this precious time, I would also note for the record, the majority plans 15 more legislative days between now and the rest of the year. 15 days. With 15 million unemployed people, the economy in shambles, their plan is to work for 15 more days, take the rest of the year off. Well, a lot of other Americans have the rest of the year off too, involuntarily. Involuntarily. So we'll proceed with this markup and the majority will vote their way and we will object to what happens. We are missing the point. We should be working together to put Americans back to work. That's what's wrong with this substitute. That's what's wrong with this bill, and that's why I oppose it. Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to my friend from New Jersey.
I thank my friend for yielding. Talk about the parallel universes. I had a discussion on Monday with a man who runs a small company that does waterproofing of basements, mainly for residential properties. He's very busy, unfortunately, because of the hurricane damage we had in the summer. And he can't get a business loan. He ran this company, had 80 employees, had to cut back to about 25. Impeccable credit, never missed a payment, can't get a loan. If I go home tonight and say to him, and he asks me, what'd you do today? Well, we voted on a law that said that if anyone ever tries to unionize you, there's going to be a new set of rules as to when you have to file an appeal and when you can get an election. He'd be moderately interested in that. That is not on his mind. He has the chance to hire 10 or 15 people this week if he can get a bank loan. What are we doing about that? Now, my friend from Tennessee says, well, we passed a Dodd-Frank bill. You know what that Dodd-Frank bill did? It made it easier for the banks to abuse credit card holders. That's what that bill had nothing to do with loans to small businesses. It was actually all about whether or not banks can abuse people who have their credit cards. If I go home and say to my friend with a home remodeling business, well, what we did do earlier this year was make it easier for banks that are charging 25% on credit cards to continue doing so. He's not going to. We're the ones living in the parallel universe here, folks. Let's get to work on things that really matter. I thank my friend.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Andrews.
I thank my friend for yielding. I also want to make a point. My friend from Michigan talks about dueling public opinion surveys. I do frankly think the weight of those surveys are on the side of small business people who say that lack of customers and lack of credit is their main problem. That certainly comports what I heard from 60 small business people in my district I've met with in the last 3 weeks, where I went in and said, look, don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Don't tell me what you think. Do tell me what you think might offend me or hurt my feelings if you want to say something, but what stands between you and hiring people? And almost uniformly what they have said is, we need more customers, and many of us are having a hard time borrowing money. And yes, there are a few regulations that come up. We had one in our area where our utility company is thinking about building a new nuclear plant generator. I'm in favor of it. And there was a rule the EPA was thinking about that would regulate the amount of water they could take in to cool the cooling towers. And I thought that the rule didn't make a whole lot of sense and wrote a letter asking that it be modified, and it's been modified. So yeah, I think there are some regulations that ought to be looked at. But this is not what we're hearing, and more importantly, rather than battling public opinion surveys, let's look at what's actually happened out in the real world when employers have let people go. The Department of Labor has kept since 2007 data on the reasons for large layoffs across the country. So these are actual employers that have actually made decisions to actually lay people off, and they've been asked why they did it. In 2010, the number of layoffs caused by lack of demand, according to the employers, 384,565. 30.6% of those laid off. The number of layoffs caused by government regulation, 2,971, 0.2%. So when you ask employers that have actually laid people off in the last year, in 2010, why they did it, 60 times as many have said they made that decision because of lack of demand, as did government regulation. So even if you accept the fact that there is some nexus, and I think there is, between irrational regulation and layoffs, it is a very small piece of the problem. There used to be agreement that transportation investment created jobs. I don't know where that agreement went. I've heard almost every member of the other side take a solemn oath never to raise taxes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't use your majority and act by December 31st, middle-class families are going to get a $1,500 a year tax increase if you don't act. There ought to be some consensus instead of this endless ideological war over the National Labor Relations Board, Why don't we work together to put people back to work? I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Ms. McCarthy's amendment. The circumstances that we're under here are that a group of people try to unionize a workplace. The labor board at the regional level certifies the bargaining unit. They say, yep, it should be the licensed practical nurses and some other people. That's the right unit. And the employer challenges that certification by the labor board. The issue is who has the burden of proof in challenging that certification. Whether it was Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower or Lyndon Johnson or Gerald Ford or Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, frankly. Labor boards all through the years have said under those circumstances, the employer has the burden of proof of showing the bargaining unit is wrong. The underlying bill alters that established tradition and established precedent, and it's wrong because it shifts that burden of proof. I think the burden of proof today is on the members of the committee who don't want to see us go forward with legislation to help create jobs in our country. And I again hearken back to a discussion that I had with an employer about 10 days ago in my district. This small business person prints specialty forms. So if you're a hospital and you need specialty forms for billing, or a school and you need specialty forms for report cards, this gentleman prints those specialty forms. He believes he has enough demand from his clients to hire about 10 more people. He has 11 employees right now. He has, at any given time, $500,000 of receivables. He's gone to his bankers and asked for a $200,000 line of credit. I'll say this again. His receivables at any given time are $500,000. He wants to borrow 40% of his receivables as a line of credit where he could buy more product, print more forms, sell more forms, and hire more people. He's been to 6 banks and cannot get a loan. His question to me was, when I, as a taxpayer, forked over my share of the $700 billion to bail out the large banks of the country, and they made it through, and they succeeded, and they paid and continue to pay their top executives enormous amounts of money. If I held up my end of the bargain, why aren't they holding up their end of the bargain? Why can't I get a bank loan under those circumstances? The activities of the committee this morning are not answering his question. So we will go home and say to him, well, I can't get you that loan, but if some of your employees ever want to form a bargaining unit, there's a whole new set of rules that will help you in that situation. Parallel universe is the phrase was used earlier. This is absolutely a parallel universe. In the world of the American people who are suffering with the worst economy since the Second World War, they want action on things like credit for small businesses, on the avoidance of a $1,500 tax increase on the middle class that looms on January 1st if the majority does not act. They understand, as Republicans have for generations, that putting people to work fixing bridges and building water treatment plants and wiring up school libraries for the internet puts people to work and makes the country more competitive. We are doing none of that. So this amendment is about the burden of proof. It says that the burden of proof will now always shift to those trying to organize a union. That's a bad idea. But what's even worse about the idea, it does not meet the majority's burden of proof of explaining to the people of the country why, after 15 million unemployed, after millions of people in jeopardy of losing their houses, again and again and again, we bring up legislation that is at best irrelevant to solving that problem and at worst harmful. We should support Ms. McCarthy's amendment. We should change the agenda of the committee and put the country back to work.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Andrews.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank him for his patience. I would just make this point about the concept of germaneness, its meaning as opposed to its strict technical application. We offered an amendment through Mrs. Davis to create jobs through improving 35,000 American schools, putting electricians to work, plumbers and pipe fitters to work, carpenters to work, bricklayers to work. And the committee just decided not to take a vote on that because it's not germane to the purposes of the markup. On the other hand, one of our brothers and brother on the other side said earlier in the markup that by eliminating unnecessary regulations, we are helping to create jobs. I think the context was that all of the deep anxiety felt about these new labor board rules, if it were somehow lifted, there would be a burst of job creation activity throughout the country. It strikes me that the majority really can't have it both ways on this. Either the purpose of this bill is to create jobs, and therefore other ideas to create jobs are germane, or the purpose of the hearing isn't to create jobs. I would choose option B, personally. I don't think the purpose of this markup is to create jobs at all. I think it is to carry on an ideological argument. And I'm well aware of the fact that my argument may not have much appeal in the technical analysis of the germaneness rule. But only in Washington can a markup about creating jobs not consider an idea to create jobs. So it's one or the other. I would suggest the markup's not about creating jobs. It is very consistent, though, with the majority's record since the first week of January. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regret that my friend left a few minutes ago who was expressing understandable concern about the possibility of coercion if an election was handled electronically. I by the way, think that the gentlelady's amendment we just disposed of deals with all those questions. It leaves in place anti-coercion provisions. It provides for voter privacy, much in the same way an absentee ballot does in our elections, as Mr. Miller just said. But if he's worried about coercion, and he should be, so am I. I want people to make a free and informed choice. Here's his opportunity to do something about it. Because this amendment deals with the problem of what are called captive audience meetings. Now, I can't think of anything more coercive in the context of a union election than my employer calling me in to a meeting I must attend and outlining to me all the reasons why I shouldn't vote for the union. Never saying, because it would be an unfair labor practice. Now, I want to let you all know that if anybody votes for the union, I'm going to fire you. Employer can't say that. Although now if they say that and move the work somewhere else, they'd be able to under the Boeing bill, but that's a different story. I can't imagine anything more coercive than that when the implicit threat that the person who signs my paycheck at the end of the week is telling me exactly how strongly he wants me to vote no in a meeting I have to go to during work hours. That sounds what I would say presumptively coercive. So this amendment says that we shouldn't have those meetings unless both sides agree that it's a fair thing to do or both sides can be heard. I think that's a pretty fair anti-coercion idea, and I would hope that my friend would extend his legitimate concern about coercion to this idea. Now, I have a legitimate concern that's not being met here again, and that is that for a lot of Americans, this whole discussion is entirely hypothetical. Because you can't get called into a mandatory meeting that your employer calls if you don't have a job. I think there's a lot of Americans who might like that opportunity today, frankly, because it means they have a job, and they don't have them. And in the 2,000 interactions we have had with small businesses in the last 3 or 4 weeks, they've said to us some very clear things. We aren't hiring people because we don't have enough customers. So we have ideas that would put electricians to work wiring schools for the internet, but we're not voting on that. We have ideas that say that a middle-class family that is looking at a guaranteed $1,500 tax increase on New Year's Day, if the majority doesn't act, we say we should act. So they have more money in their pocket, not less, and can buy more in the stores and not less. We have an idea that says that some of the $700 billion in taxpayer money that went to the largest financial institutions in America should be loaned back to the small businesses of America who create 2/3 of the jobs in this country. But we're not having a meeting about that. We have an idea that says that if a small business creates jobs, if it hires someone, they should get a tax cut. We're not having a meeting about that. We're having a meeting about the rules that obtain when someone wants to try to organize a union. This is a serious topic. It's a serious topic that deserves attention. But if you were to ask, if any member of this committee were to ask 100 of their constituents at random today, at a shopping mall or a diner or a senior center, the 10 things they'd like the Congress to work on, I really doubt this would be on the list. I think what they'd be talking about is get people back to work, help our small businesses thrive, help our seniors with their difficulties in their retiring years. So, you know, this might be called the Seinfeld markup. We're having a markup about almost nothing, at a time when the country has very, very significant problems that we should be addressing. Seinfeld was a very funny show. This is no laughing matter. We should approve this amendment and get to work putting Americans back to work.
Apparently the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. And it is a very short amendment, so the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
The brevity was with you in mind, Mr. Chairman.
And
know how
as
you...
a non-lawyer, you know I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. The chairman's substitute that we're looking at today improves but does not correct an underlying flaw in the bill that was introduced that was the subject of the legislative hearing. The original bill required that every claim dealing with representation, pre-election representation, every claim had to be decided on by the National Labor Relations Board before an election could take place. This was, frankly, going to result in elections being delayed years and years and years, and it's fair to say that the paralysis it would cause at the Labor Board, which may have been intended, would mean the Labor Board could not get anything done. The underlying substitute purports to fix this problem, but I don't think it does sufficiently. Here's the problem with what's in front of the committee right now and why my amendment would attempt to fix it. The state of the bill before the committee today says that if there are challenges to a representation pre-election, that the election cannot take place until the board considers first the question whether it's going to take the appeal or not. So it sort of sets up two choices for the board. Yes, we will hear the appeal, which stops the election. No, we will not hear the appeal, which means the election proceeds. There's really a third choice, though, which is we haven't gotten around to deciding yes or no yet. If you have a flood of representation claims, pre-election representation claims coming to the board, the fact that the board would have to consider that predicate question of whether to take the appeal or not would in and of itself slow down the election process for no valid reason. That's problem number one. Problem number two is a more practical one, but I think in the present political context it's a very truthful one. The odds of this administration getting an NLRB nominee through the Senate are roughly equivalent to the odds of me playing quarterback for the Eagles this Sunday. Michael Vick's a lot better at it than I am, so let's hope he plays. It is not going to happen. And so the practical likelihood is the board won't have a quorum under a lot of circumstances in the future. A board without a quorum cannot determine whether to hear an appeal or not. So even if you assume that the great majority of the potential appeals are not heard, the board can't make a dispositive decision on that, which means the practical effect is the same as the underlying bill, that you wait forever to have the election take place. Much in the way that we are waiting forever to have the majority consider any bill on the floor of the House that would put the American people back to work. For those reasons, I would urge adoption of the amendment.
The gentleman yield?
I would be happy to yield to my friend
I
from
would just
California.
say, I think, again, we have to acknowledge the political environment that we live in, and I think you make an important point. I think that if this were to become law, and I don't think it will and hope it won't, that it almost demands that you not approve a third member of the board, because now you have the ability to stifle all progress.
Yeah, if the gentleman would yield it, it sort of paints a roadmap or draws a roadmap, rather, for those who would want to completely stop all elections. Here's what you do. You would pass the bill that's in front of the committee, and then you'd have your allies in the Senate, who don't need anything close to a majority, tie up any appointments to the board. No quorum, no decision. No decision, no election. No NLRB. No unions. Now, that's a goal some people set forth. If they want to do that, they should be explicit about it, but let's not accomplish that same unwelcome goal, in my opinion, unwelcome goal, with the tactic that's in front of us. I would once again yield my friend from
I was
California.
just thinking maybe we could adopt the amendment and abolish the Senate.
Well,
You see?
there might be some broad bipartisan consensus
thought we could
on
get
that
some
point.
majority.
I'm not going to get into that, but unicameral legislatures are inherently more efficient than bicameral legislatures. Mr. Chairman, do you have a view on this?
I was offering up UC, but
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
the gentleman yields back. Who seeks the gentleman from New Jersey?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It is my final amendment of the day.
The clerk will distribute the amendment.
Although, one wonders if we could strike a deal here. If in fact my final amendment, would you adopt it? But I won't be so optimistic.
I discourage that kind of optimism. It is indeed a short amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, it is a mantra of the majority side that one size should not fit all, that federal mandates are inherently suspicious and almost always wrong, that any hard and fast deadline on anything is a mistake. The bill, of course, creates a one-size-fits-all mandate that can never be, as I see this, is fits-all situations without exception, which is that all elections will take place no less than 35 days from the filing a petition for an election. Now, there are circumstances when an election should take place far later than 35 days. If there are legitimate differences about the size of the bargaining unit or the membership of the bargaining unit or the validity of the signatures on the petition or other of relevant points covered in the statute. But there are many circumstances where it would make sense that all of those issues are resolved, and it would make sense to have the election in fewer than 35 days. So I offer this amendment not about any particular election or any particular number of days that I think are the right answer. I offer this because I think the person who's best situated to determine what the right answer is, if there's a disputed situation. By the way, if there's a collegial situation, then the employer and the union should decide when the election is. But if there's a disputed situation, then I think that the regional director or his or her subordinates are best positioned to make that decision, and not us. So think about this, that in the education legislation, we hear that we should not have a single definition of adequate yearly progress because one size doesn't fit all. And in the OSHA regulations, we hear that we shouldn't have one standard for cement dust in the air because one size does not fit all. When we look at the Workforce Investment Act, which we don't seem to do, we don't have one set of standards for veterans hiring or for job training for single moms because one size does not fit all. Well, is this the situation where one size fits all? Is this the black swan? I mean, I don't quite understand this, and I don't see any justification for why we should have one size fit all here. And for the record, because I've I think we've consistently said this all day. The context of this discussion, again, strikes me as almost bizarre. That, you know, tomorrow will be the day a lot of Americans have their homes foreclosed on and lose their home. Tomorrow will be the day a lot of people get their last unemployment check. Tomorrow will be the day that a lot of businesses close shop for the last time because they can't survive. And we are arguing about how many days there ought to be between a union petition being filed and an election. I just don't think that's the argument that the country needs. I think the country needs cooperation. And it needs cooperation on a plan that would put the American people back to work. So I eagerly await the answer to my non-rhetorical question, was why does one size fit all here when it doesn't in so many other circumstances? And I would ask for a yes vote on this amendment. I yield back.